So, the government says, we've got to support the collapse of housing prices, for example, and yet it's these pricing collapses that makes everything ripe for the big banks to pick up assets at fire sale prices, and so it's just ripe for a tremendous consolidation of world wealth.
Well, we know
and that's what we're seeing.
We know that Frank Carlucci and other people with the Carlyle Group back in the 80s into 1990, they put out bad news about defense. They said it was all over. A lot of it went very close to bankrupting or did bankrupt, and they bought it all up for pennies on the dollar, then started the Iraq War through their client Saddam, who they set up, and then the prices ballooned right after they'd had that vertical integration. So that was a mini version of what we see now.
That's correct. And I'm working on this video that I'm going to make later on this month where I go back in American history. And if you go back, say, to Thomas Jefferson, for example, or James Madison, early presidents who understood the banking system, what they warn about is the ability of the banks to produce inflation followed by deflation. Because with inflation, they make tremendous profits because of the interest rates and the compound interest they charge on the inflating economy. Then, when the inflation has gone as far as it can go, they pull back credit, they constrict credit, and that causes a crash of prices. That causes a deflation. When the deflation occurs, they're able then to step in and buy up assets very cheaply, and we are seeing now the biggest deflation in world history, at least as far as we can detect.
When we come back, I'll pull up the famous Thomas Jefferson quote, but they're all similar about if we ever allow private banks to take control of the money power, first through inflation, then through deflation, they will completely enslave everybody, and we will wake up slaves on the continent our forebears conquered. That's basically a paraphrase, because they'd done this in Europe over and over again. They were trying to set that up here.
The word Jefferson uses is very instructive. He says, we will wake up homeless on the continent our fathers conquered. Homeless. He was talking about the housing bubble, wasn't he?
Because this is how they ruled Europe. I mean, the Rothschilds in 1815 went in and panicked them, saying Napoleon had won, and bought it all up as well. I mean, it's constant.
Yeah, it was their goal, and this was even put out in writing by the American Bankers Association somewhere in the late 1800s. The goal is to reduce the American population to renters. They recognize that people who own their homes are people who have some pride, who have assets of their own, who have independence. So take away their homes, their property, and leave them so poor they can only rent. Then you can control the population.
Richard C. Cook, powerful information, and he's 100% on target. RichardCCook.com. Our websites are PrisonPlanet.tv and Infowars.com. We'll be right back after this quick break. We'll talk about how we defeat them. We are back live. Here is a quote by U.S. founding father, drafted the Declaration of Independence, third U.S. president, in 1802 in a letter to then Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin. He said, we've got it up on screen right now for PrisonPlanet.tv viewers. By the way, this quote is in the Obama Deception, to give you an idea of the type of things this film covers. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issuance of their money, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Homeless. This has been done over and over again, and for maybe 50 years, 60 years maximum, the founders, and then Andrew Jackson, the fruit of the founders, and he fought the Revolutionary War when he was 12 and 13, they knew the game plan, and on his deathbed, Andrew Jackson said, what are you most proud of? He said, I killed the bank. You should read his final address. That half a century of somewhat economic freedom made us what we are today. That's what allowed us to grow. And the foreign banks wrote in the Times of London, we can't allow what's happening in America. The world's figuring out the scam we run. We've got to shut them down. And they tried to kill Andrew Jackson and others. Going back to Richard C. Cook, any comments on that quote I was just covering? And then, now that we know they're doing this, from studying the architecture of the world banking system they're setting up, what is this thing going to look like if they succeed with the carbon taxes and all the controls, versus how do we defeat them?
Well, those are great quotes. I include those in this new video that I'm making, and it goes all the way up to the Civil War, because the financiers of Europe, and it's been well documented by people who were there at the time, their objective was to break up the United States, because the United States, a democracy where the people controlled their own currency, thanks to people like Andrew Jackson, was the biggest threat on the earth to the monarchies of Europe and to the financial rule of the Rothschilds and the other big banking families. So when the Civil War began and Abraham Lincoln went to the New York banks, they wanted to charge him interest rates anywhere from 25 to 35%. And Lincoln said, forget that, and that's why he introduced the greenbacks, where the government had the ability, he knew it, to just spend money directly into circulation for the items they needed to purchase to prosecute the war without going through the banks. The Civil War financially was a miracle, because we fought a war without any debt to the banks whatsoever. We had the greenbacks, we sold war bonds directly to the people, and we raised excise taxes and introduced a small income tax. But the miracle was the Union was preserved without debt to the banks, and the European banks hated it. The London Times hated it. But I'm looking at a website here that has the stock market activity for today.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really interesting number here, Alex, that illustrates what we're talking about. You know, Citibank from the 11th of February to the 20th of February went down 42%, right? The stock just plummeted, and so everybody says, oh, that's terrible, Citibank's in such bad shape. Well, today, Citibank stock has been sold in the amount of 360 million shares at a very low price. So what does that mean? That means that the people with the money have come back into the market now, and they're buying Citibank shares for half of what it sold for 3 weeks ago.
They're getting the people out of...
Huge profiteering going on here.
They're getting the people out of the ownership. This is vertical integration.
That's right. They've driven the small stockholders, the mutual funds, they've driven them out. And now the people with the money have come back in to buy that enormous financial institution for pennies on the dollar. There couldn't be a better illustration of what is going on.
So they took the pension funds money, the government employee money, the private pension fund money, the mom and pop stock market money. They weren't about to let the baby boomers have this. Notice right as they're retiring, they did this, and they bragged they're doing it. They destroy confidence, drive it all down, engorge themselves with cash while the stock itself's down, then go in and buy it up themselves.
Yeah, that's what's happened with Citibank, and we're seeing the similar things happening today with Bank of America and American Express. They're doing the same thing with those two.
I want to hear from you what you think the winner banks, the banks that are going to leave standing, who those will be, versus what front corporations like Enron and Toolco and Global Crossing, because we know both these front companies fence the money out offshore and then implode them to rip off the shareholders and employees. But now this is on a wider scale. Where you see that going in solutions to this, Richard C. Cook, and your phone call straight ahead. Stay with us. Coming up in just a few minutes, we're going to be taking your calls from Richard C. Cook, economic historian, government analyst, former government analyst for the White House, author. But I wanted to go back to you, sir, and again, specifically, because we're out of time in the last segment, quantify simply the New World Order, Anglo-American banking establishment's plan. A, B, is it going well for them? And then C, how do we combat this?
Well, the plan is to allow the bubble to collapse. This is what has been called, and you're probably familiar with the term, listeners are probably familiar with the term, the soft landing. That's to allow the bubble to collapse without taking down the entire system with it. It does take down a lot of small financial institutions. It took down Lehman. It took down Merrill Lynch, which was sold to Bank of America. So they're letting the small fish collapse while the big ones come in and eat up everything in sight and consolidate their control, which is why the big four, Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and J.P. Morgan Chase are all going to come through this, because they're going to be the ones who are the recipients of the additional bailout monies that are going to be coming through the Obama budget for 2009-2010, the budget that was just announced the other day. Then, meanwhile, the producing economy, the economy where we live and work, we're going to see depression-level unemployment. We're going to see cuts in social services. We're going to see Social Security cut back. We're going to see Medicare cut back. All of those benefit programs are going to be sacrificed to a significant extent. We're already seeing the not just the standard of living in the United States collapsing, but also the life expectancy. All of this stuff is going to lead to a depressed economy, which is going to be, at levels of maybe a half or less, 40% of economic activity that we've seen in the last decade, and then the banks will just start rebuilding it through more lending, but at a much lower price level, a much lower level of economic activity, and the whole cycle just starts all over again.